Yellow paint and its lack of coverage has been giving hobbyists problems since the dawn of time, or at least as long as I can remember, but I'm determined to find a good yellow paint. I've already amassed a decent collection of yellow paints, but I also want to take a trip to the art store and see what other great paints I can find there. I assume anyone watching this already has some experience with yellow hobby paints, whether that's good or bad, and is at least familiar with the different hobby paints available and has some experience either firsthand or through word of mouth. For that, I want to introduce something new and talk about artist paints in this video and how they can be applied for Warhammer. Artist paints are typically considered high quality with good pigmentation and a pretty good value once you consider how much paint you get per tube. I also really like how they have specs on them. If you take a close look, you'll see that they list out things like what pigments are in there, and they have these little squares indicating how opaque a paint is versus transparent. For example, a full black square represents that the paint is opaque, while this diagonally halved one is semi-opaque. Some tubes of paint also have a stroke of paint over black dashed lines, giving you an even better example. All of this really helps out with what we're looking for. I also found that inside the store they have these really great swatches showing the coverage of the paint over black and white for the tubes that were lacking something like that on the label. To also help narrow the search down, I'm going to be looking for paints that have a similar viscosity to hobby paints, so I'm going to be looking for soft-bodied or fluid acrylics. And while my eye was initially drawn to the great coverage of this heavy body one, there are diminishing returns when thinning something like this down, and there's really no telling how it will perform once it's at a sort of hobby paint consistency that you'd want for Warhammer. So instead, I'd rather start at somewhere close to the correct consistency, like this soft body Liquitex paint. This still looks like it has great coverage, judging from the swatch. I returned from the store having purchased two different yellows, Liquitex soft body cadmium free yellow, and golden fluid acrylics Diarylide yellow. The cadmium free yellow was chosen based off the coverage displayed at the store, and its opaqueness was indicated with the little black square icon. Cadmium yellow is known for its opaque quality amongst yellows, and it's often represented with pigment yellow 35. However, it is toxic, and instead safer cadmium hue paints are used, but they're usually considered pretty inferior compared to the real thing. Interestingly enough though, the cadmium-free paints at the store were lacking in what pigment they contained. This was unique compared to the other colors, even within the same paint range. It appears they've created a new paint with all the great coverage of cadmium yellow, but without the harmful effects of all those heavy metals. The golden fluid acrylic was also a great find. Golden is a quality paint brand I knew I could rely on, and the fluid aspect of it meant that it would have a great consistency for painting miniatures. I chose the color Diarylide yellow as it seemed like it had the best coverage amongst the line when comparing the brushstrokes on the labels. The first colors I wanted to test was this variety of Liquitex Basics yellows I had. Liquitex Basics would denote it's a bit of a lower quality than the new yellows I just purchased, but I was curious to see how the different yellows and their unique pigment makeups would compare to one another across the same paint line. To start the test, I made a series of dashes across a sketchbook page with a black Sharpie and labeled my sections accordingly. Altogether, I had Naples yellow hue, primary yellow hue, cadmium yellow light hue, cadmium yellow medium hue, and cadmium yellow deep hue. I thinned each paint down to a consistency like I would for painting a miniature, and went about adding them to my test areas. My initial test didn't really show any interesting findings, so I created another series of denser, more close together dashes and repeated the process. Overall, I think these all suffer from poor coverage typical to yellow. But if I had to pick, I'd say the 3 cadmium yellow paints performed the best, which got me pretty excited to test my new cadmium-free cadmium yellow. Before moving on to the second block of tests, I also rounded up 2 more paints from my girlfriend's collection to use as outliers. As every other paint was acrylic, I also wanted to test out a gouache. This is a paint that's similar to watercolor in its makeup, but in practice, it's sometimes described as in between a watercolor and an acrylic paint, allowing you to use it a bit thicker or also thin it down to a watery consistency that's still super rich in color. Gouache is known for its matte finish and opaque quality and was typically used in the animation industry because of this. So even if you've never heard of gouache, you've probably seen it before in your favorite animated movies. The next paint I wanted to try out was this tube of Sonja acrylic paint, Yellow Deep. This is a brand I was super unfamiliar with until just recently when my girlfriend and her family introduced it to me. Overall, I'm super impressed with it, and it has a really great value. It's quite affordable and it's really good quality, especially when you compare it to other things in its price range. We know it's great for traditional painting on canvas, but I was really curious to see how well it would perform in these tests. After making a series of dashed sections and labeling them, I first checked out a Sonja. As you can see, I did a couple of runs with this one, as it took me a couple tries to get the right consistency, as it was a bit heavier bodied. And I wanted to make sure I was being fair, as I first laid it down a little thick, but overall I thought the coverage was pretty solid. The gouache also had good coverage, but in thinning it down it still had a bit of grittiness to it, which wouldn't really be suitable for painting miniatures, as it might build texture or gunk up detail. I also tested out a tube of Utrecht Heavy Body Medium Yellow, and while I really like this for big tubes of paint and painting canvas, by the time I thinned it down to warhammer consistency, the coverage was pretty poor, which I expected, but I wanted to try out anyway. Following this was my 2 new paints, which I was really excited to try out, and they did not disappoint. Upon first using the Diarylide Yellow from Golden, I could tell there was a huge upgrade. The color was rich and the coverage was great. This trend continued when I used the Liquitex cadmium-free yellow, creating great coverage and immediately blocking out some of those black dashes, even in the thinned down consistency. After this, I wanted to move on to something more similar to the true application, instead of just painting little swatches in my sketchbook. The Liquitex cadmium-free yellow and the Golden Diarylide yellow were both the top performers. I also wanted to give the Sonja another go, as it wasn't too far behind. For the next stage, I took a piece of plastic card or sheet styrene, and this time painted the dash marks with black primer, emulating something akin to a model, going over a couple of the marks just to make sure it was true black. Starting with the Liquitex cadmium-free yellow medium, I first tested it straight out of the tube, and then a more thinned down application, similar to how I would paint a miniature. Since the plastic is just untreated besides the stripes of primer, the more watered down application does beat up a bit, but it's still easy to judge the coverage based on the primed areas. The Sonja was up next, which performed well, but not quite as good as the cadmium-free Liquitex. Then I moved on to the Golden Fluid Acrylics Diarylide Yellow. Out of the tube, this probably has the best consistency for miniature painting, and while it has great coverage when thinned down to a similar consistency as the others, it didn't quite hold up to the Liquitex cadmium-free yellow medium, which I think has the superior coverage by a small margin. Meaning that the winner of the best yellow paint was the Liquitex soft body cadmium-free yellow medium, with our Golden Fluid Acrylic Diarylide Yellow a very close runner-up. Now this video wouldn't be complete if we didn't also try it out on some models, but before that I want to say if you're interested in purchasing any of these paints yourself, I've included some links in the description of the video. I get a small amount of money for each purchase made, so it's a great way to support the channel if you're interested in trying these paints out yourself. I grabbed a couple older orc models to try these out. And when using these yourself in a genuine painting scenario, it's likely that you'll be starting off with a white primer or a lighter in-between cover, but for the purpose of the video, I wanted to show something a bit more extreme and try painting it right over dark colors. The model's left shoulder pad has been base coated black, and the one on his right was base coated a dark brown. I'm applying pretty thin layers as I would with any other paint, but even with just one layer on there, the coverage is pretty impressive. There's definitely some streaking, but overall I think it's super solid. The trend continued with the classic 2 thin coats on there, with a very minimal amount of paint showing through, and overall some very nice coverage from this yellow paint. Once finished, I was really happy with the opacity and quality of the paint. I applied some pretty thin layers, but was able to build up some really nice coverage over black with just a few passes. This is really impressive to me, as even that base coat of black I applied took more than 2 thin layers to get a nice smooth finish. That being said, you can see that there is a bit of a texture buildup when I switch the lighting, but I do think that this is more of a user error on my part, as I got a little excited and tried to really push the coverage instead of just taking my time. These are also pretty old models that I didn't do an awesome job spray priming, and you can kind of see that on the other parts of the model. But overall, I'm really happy with this paint and I think it performs super well. Here's another yellow shoulder pad on a more complete model. This was also built up with just the same Liquitex cadmium free yellow medium paint straight over black. I did a bit of weathering and chipping to tie it into the model and gave it a super light dry brush of some white mixed into the yellow to give it a more complete result. I think it's a pretty great showcase of the paint, but the really interesting point to me is that if I were to actually paint this yellow onto a model outside of the video, this really isn't even how I would be using it. This yellow is super bright and rich, something that you would build up to and would probably end up being the final layer or even a highlight. This paint could be mixed down and into other colors to become a more routine part of a typical painting process, but I do think it's a pretty great testament that I was able to just slap it right down over black, which is a pretty extreme example. If you're looking at painting an entire Imperial Fifths or Bad Moon's army, you might be better off with a yellow rattle can or some contrast paint over a really light primer, but I think this Liquitex yellow is really great for all other uses. It allows you to paint sections of your model a really nice vivid yellow without worrying about the splotchiness that other yellows are known for, and I'm really excited to have found it. As a closing thought, I also want to give some praise to the golden fluid acrylics. I think this paint had really great coverage and its consistency was really nice right out of the bottle, making it really suitable for Warhammer and other miniatures. The paint is really high quality and competitively priced when you consider that you're getting 30 milliliters compared to Citadel's 12 or Vallejo's 17. And in the future, I'm definitely going to keep it in mind when it comes time for me to get some new colors. Thanks for watching.